Okay, great. So our second presentation today is on design guidelines, which some of you may have, some of you may not have, some of you might know a lot about or nothing about. So Mike Gioulis is our presenter on this topic, and he has been working in historic preservation since the 1980s. And after working at SHPO here, he started his own consulting firm and has worked with communities all over the state and outside the state, actually, as well, to complete National Register nominations, historic tax credit projects, design guidelines, all kinds of odds and ends. He's kind of involved kind of everywhere. And Claire added this: in his free time, Mike loves to ride his motorcycle. So anyway, turning it over to Mike.
Oh, okay, thanks. I probably won't be as lively a discussion as the last one because it's only going to be my voice and you're going to get bored with it, but that's okay. And it'll be a presentation more than a discussion. And I will probably reiterate or repeat some of the things that the previous panel discussed, especially about the benefits of preservation. So let me get my screen up. I present now, right? And we want screen one, share that, bring this up. Okay, here we go. So as Meredith said, this discussion is regarding the use and creation and benefits of design guidelines. I want to go over what they are, how you establish them or develop them, what their benefits are, and then a couple of slides about the practice of conducting historic preservation or historic review, design review. You'll see most of my slides when I show examples of projects will be from a couple of them, ones that I've worked with extensively or written myself. So that's my prerogative, I guess, since I'm presenting. So the history of design guidelines, the first design guidelines were established in Charleston, South Carolina, following the designation in 1931 of the Old Historic District. That was followed by New Orleans, Louisiana, with the 1937 Vieux Carré, I think that's how you pronounce it, commission, which controlled the French Quarter in New Orleans. And then following that was San Antonio in 1939. The federal government got involved in establishing design review for Georgetown, which was up and coming in 1950. And then one of the more prominent or famous historic district controls is in Savannah. And maybe to their benefit or maybe not, as some of the current activities are showing, but that was in 1966 and a 1973 Board of Review. In 1965, there were 51 communities in the United States that had some kind of design review. You can see in this slide that in 1976, that had grown to 500. In 1998, that had grown to 2,200. And in 2008, that had grown to 2,300, which I question, since in the 10 years between 98, it only grew 100. Seems a little questionable. And the latest statistics I could find were 2023 in Minnesota, law review article listed 3,500 design reviews in the United States. And then the chart on the right, you could see the exponential growth of this activity. In West Virginia, we have 251 historic districts, give or take. Within municipalities or incorporated areas, there are 193. Cities that have design guidelines that are considered mandatory, there are 11 of them, and ones that have recommended design guidelines, not mandatory, there are 4. There's 55 CLGs, and there are 12 of them have design guidelines. Thank you, Cody. So what are design guidelines? The Charleston, South Carolina Review Board states that the local historic districts are one of the oldest and strongest forms of protection for historic properties, and especially when twinned with design review in those historic districts. In Charleston, they also said the purpose is to establish a process that will protect and improve the visual, aesthetic, and economic value in the historic district. And then in Hinton's design guidelines, their preamble states that they assist property owners, developers, architects, etc., by offering suggestions for rehabilitation, which are compatible with the character of the historic districts. And so they are instrumental in maintaining the town's historic identity. And that's what we want to promote with design guidelines. What do design guidelines review? Generally, they're limited to the exterior alterations, rehabilitation, restoration on the exterior of buildings in the historic district. Sometimes they include signage for commercial and residential projects. If a commercial activity occurs in a residential building in a historic district, that may be controlled. Some review committees control more than that. And I'll have examples later on of what type of controls there are. But why should we review? Why should we have design review, and what benefits does it provide? In Hinton, again, in the introduction to their guidelines, one, they increase the public awareness, which the previous panel talked about, and educate the public about the importance of the historic architecture or the historic significance of the district. They help reinforce the character of the historic district. They preserve the integrity of the district. They help property owners and others make decisions on how to do the right thing to their property. So one thing that was brought up in the last panel that I want to stress is that design guidelines aren't there to tell you what not to do. They're there to help you do the right thing. They're there to tell you what you should do to protect the building and the historic district. They improve the quality of development in the district, and they protect public and private investment in the district. If somebody invests money in their property to do a rehabilitation, they want to be sure that their neighbor is going to protect that investment by doing the right thing with their property. Some of the economic benefits, again, they were mentioned previously. Property values usually increase. Studies have shown that property values increase in historic districts. This study in the city of Raleigh shows that between 2000 and 2008, general property values increased in the city by 50%, whereas in local historic districts that had design review, they increased by 90%. And in National Register districts that did not have design review, they increased by 75% plus or minus. So you could see that design review definitely impacted the property values in Raleigh. The other economic benefits that accrue because of design review or historic districts, they usually see lower foreclosure rates than citywide counterparts. As we said, the property values usually stay high or go higher than other portions of the city. And Donovan Ripkema, who was mentioned previously, in a recent study in Savannah, showed that the sale of buildings in the historic districts outperformed the sale of buildings in the city as a whole. And so what he also said was that creating, preserving historic districts hits more metrics of economic growth than new construction. And it includes more jobs created during construction and after construction, lower foreclosure rates, and more startup businesses being able to occur in the historic district. So, are they legal? One of the premier cases, well, first of all, yes, They are legal. State and the federal Supreme Court have upheld decisions by design review committees, and one of the most famous of those is the Penn Central versus the City of New York, and the Supreme Court upheld and validated that the protection of historic resources is an entirely permissible government goal. You could see the Grand Central Station here, which was owned by the Penn Central Transportation. They proposed constructing a building on top of the historic, on top of the historic property. And in fact, the advertisement said that you could take an elevator directly from the track up into your office. Well, of course, that proposal was denied by the New York City Historic Landmarks Commission because of its impact on the historic district. Penn Central sued and lost. And then the building was eventually constructed, but it was constructed behind the Grand Central Terminal, and it was constructed over freight tracks. So it did not impact. There is a visual impact, of course, behind the building, but at least the building still exists as it originally was. Here in West Virginia, and I'm sorry to say that I have not been able to confirm it this week, but I had a discussion with one of the Lewisburg Historic Landmark Commission members at one time, and he said that they had been upheld by the state Supreme Court in denying a property owner's request to replace their historic windows with vinyl windows. If anybody can confirm that for me, I'd be really glad to have that. So the two types, broad categories, as I mentioned before, I think, there are mandatory design guidelines, and I'll go into those in more detail in subsequent slides. And then there are voluntary ones. The voluntary ones generally take the form of recommendations and advice to property owners or contractors or whoever. It's important with all types of guidelines, but especially voluntary ones, that they be advertised broadly so people know they exist. They be distributed widely so that they can get hold of them. And again, the previous panel discussed having educational trainings, such as with real estate agents, contractors, architects, design professionals, etc. You want to make them user-friendly so they're easy to read and they don't put you to sleep while you're reading them. And in fact, I attended a conference once where the design guidelines that had been prepared by the presenter were published as a newspaper insert. So it was basically newsprint, which everybody back then was used to reading, which we are not used to anymore. So we'll have to change the process. But it did make it kind of almost cartoonish, but easy to look at and easy to understand. And a lot of times, if a community has benefits such as loans, grants, or something like that, some Main Street communities have grants for signage or for painting buildings. A lot of times those grants will be tied to a design guideline process. So there is a distinction between the Secretary of the Interior standards and local design guidelines. The Secretary of the Interior standards were developed by a federal agency to control and relate to programs of the federal agency, the National Park Service. Local design guidelines should reflect local conditions and policies. The reason you don't want to just take a copy of the Secretary's standards and use them as your design guidelines, again, is because they were developed for a different reason. The Secretary's standards concern themselves with individual buildings and how grants or tax credits or other programs of the Park Service are to be carried out when you're working on a historic building. In a local design guideline, you're looking at protecting not only the individual building, but the entire historic district. So your historic district is a collection of buildings, not just individual ones. Another reason is the standards are broadly written because they're going to be applied over the entire country. So they don't specifically address your situation. And so your standard should reflect your historic district. And a lot of times, not a lot of times, but sometimes the standards will conflict with your local historic districts, and you have to determine when that's going to happen and how to address that. Another caveat is don't just copy some other community's guidelines. I spelled that wrong, sorry. Oh no. Because those guidelines were written for that community. For example, the Juliana Square Historic District in Parkersburg is a collection of Victorian residential buildings, medium to large scale, as you see on the lower left. And the Miami Art Deco Historic District is a collection of Art Deco buildings, as you see on the right. So the recommendations and controls and requirements for each of those districts is going to be different to address the specifics of those types of buildings. So how do you prepare them? The first thing to do is to study your National Register nomination or whatever historic resource or research has been done on your historic district. You want to look at the statement of significance, why the district is important, why the buildings are important. You want to look especially at your period of significance so that you include the buildings that contribute to that period, but don't include the ones that are outside of that period. You want to look at the overall setting and the description of a district as a whole, because again, what you're trying to do is protect the district, not the individual buildings. And you want to look at the architectural styles that are in the description and within your period of significance so that you can identify those styles and work with them. So you're identifying what we call the character defining elements in the historic district, again, not in the building. So one thing you want to look at are the architectural styles. And the styles will a lot of times relate to the period of significance because it'll be styles that were prominent during that period. So in this Hinton design guidelines, we had Foursquare architecture, we had colonial revival architecture, Queen Anne, etc. And we also had commercial architecture. And so if your district includes a commercial component, you want to make sure you address that as well. You want to identify the setting, as I said, because you're looking at a grouping of buildings, not just individual buildings. One possible component of the setting may be that all the buildings are arranged in a row, such as we have here. And you can see in the photograph, all the buildings are lined up. They address the street and the sidewalk the same way. They're basically similar in size and scale. In another portion of the residential neighborhood, the buildings were not arranged in a row. They were arranged not quite haphazardly, but there are larger front yards, side yards, different setbacks from the front yard, etc. And so you want to identify what's important in preserving in this portion of the historic district. And then in the downtown commercial section, it's totally different. The buildings are right on the sidewalk. They create a strong wall, what we call the street wall, because that's important to a commercial historic district to create that outdoor space that people are going to go to shop and to conduct services and business. So you'll have different requirements for each of those different approach settings. You want to look at the roof shape. In this case, we had, as I said, in the Foursquare, they were hip roofs. We had gable roofs. We had a gambrel roof over here on the left middle. And so you want to see how significant the appearance of the roof is and how you want to protect that. You want to look at materials, of course, masonry in a lot of our downtowns, brick, stone, sometimes what's called vitrolite or structural pigmented glass, Carrara glass. And you want to give recommendations on how to treat those materials so that they are protected and cleaned or repaired properly. Other materials could be metals, such as the cast iron storefront on the right side here. or pressed metal details or ornamentation, or sometimes even pressed metal siding that we see here on the right, lower right, or other siding materials such as shingles, clapboard siding, what we call German siding, drop siding, etc. So you want to identify what you have and make recommendations on how to preserve it. You'll look at the details in your historic district, and you may have a district, Wheeling is one of them. A lot of Wheeling historic buildings have strong decorative window hoods over the window, lower left photograph. And so you want to identify if that's significant to your district and to the buildings in your district. There may be stone or other type of masonry detailing, such as the upper right. And then there's also, in this case, there's what's called a jack arch over the windows. You want to identify that as being significant and worthy of preservation. And then in some of the residential buildings, predominantly, you'll see some of this architectural carpenter scroll work and the drop finial here in the gable end. That'll occur in a lot of your Victorian era residences. In looking at commercial areas or commercial districts, some resource materials that may help include preservation brief number 11, and then also the National Park Service Guide to tax credits in Main Street commercial buildings and districts. They both have good recommendations on how to deal with commercial buildings. The things you're looking at in a commercial building and a commercial district are, one thing that's very prominent is building height. Are they typically 2 and 3 stories, or are they typically 5, 6, and 7 stories? You want to look at that, and you want to, if you're going to control the height, you might want to control it by an actual number, such as no more than 2 stories or no more than 35 feet tall, or you might want to control it by saying within 10% of the adjacent building's height. And that would apply predominantly to new construction and additions to buildings. You want to look at something called the rhythm of the storefronts. In a downtown commercial, storefront entrances are usually about 30 to 35 feet apart because the buildings are about 30 to 35 feet wide. And that creates a rhythm in your downtown, which encourages people to become pedestrians and to shop in your downtown, and it makes a comfortable feeling. And then you want to look at the storefront. This illustration of the parts of a storefront building help explain that. There's what's called the display windows, which are on the side of the entrance so that you could display your goods. There's the transoms above, which let light into the back of the storefront. There are kick panels below because generally your goods were displayed at a slightly higher level instead of on the floor. There's a secondary cornice that separates the first floor from the lower floor. That cornice usually is somewhere around 13 feet, 12 feet tall. And what it does is it controls your view of the storefront as you're walking down the street so that you're predominantly looking at the retail space and not at the upper levels. Other considerations you might include in your design guidelines are awnings, colors, which is a very tricky situation. You want to be very careful about controlling colors. There are some design review committees that do have color controls. Some of them provide an appropriate color palette. Most manufacturers have what they call a historic color palette. You might want to control signage. You want to make sure you address accessibility into buildings and the ADA. You want to look at codes, including the energy code. And then now there's more and more solar panels being installed on buildings, and you want to make sure you address that or be prepared to address that. You're looking at new construction and additions, as we said, but you might be looking at parking as well. Where to park? Do you park in front of the building? Do you park on the front lawn? Do you require parking in the rear? Fences, where do you place a fence? And then you want to make sure you have an appendix to give people additional resources and a glossary, because some of the terms you're going to use people are not familiar with. So how do you create these? What is the process? So and I'm going to discuss mandatory because I went through the advisory previously, but in mandatory, most of them have to do with drawing a building permit for construction in the city. And so most of the mandatory design guidelines are part of that building permit process, and they require, for you to successfully pull a permit, they require you to have a certificate of appropriateness. Other items to consider, and I'll go over these again, are how do you conduct a meeting, how do you vote, and what do you do about appeals? In West Virginia, the governing code is Chapter 8, Municipal Corporations, Article 26, and they give the powers of the Historic Landmark Commission, which includes the allowability to enact design guidelines in historic districts that are designated by the Historic Landmark Commission. Now, if you do that, you have to have that chapter or that section in your ordinance that establishes the Landmark Commission, and then you would be following the local requirements for passage of the ordinance itself, such as how many readings does it go before City Council, what's the notification process, and things like that. But once you establishing design review, or when you establish a new historic district that's going to have design review, you need to notify the property owners within that historic district. And if more than 50% of the owners object to it, then you cannot have design review. Now, the code does have a provision that says that historic landmark commissions may institute appropriate action to enforce their review. And there are penalties for people who do not abide by the regulation of up to 10% of the cost of the project and or 6 months in jail. So it gets serious at sometimes. So if it's part of your building permit process, you want to publish the forms and the requirements, both online. A lot of cities have online presence now, and a lot of the forms required for building permits and other things are online, so that's good. I've had trouble finding Historic Landmark Commission information on some cities I've looked at recently, but it's better to have more than not enough. You want to identify that some items may be able to be reviewed by staff rather than by the committee as a whole. In some communities, items such as painting a building, if you are painting it the same color as it is now, is strictly reviewed by the staff, and it doesn't have to go through a lengthy process of being put on the calendar and reviewed by the design committee. So other things may be included in that too, such as repairing a porch or repairing windows if you're not changing the windows. So some communities have exclusions for the process. When you're conducting a meeting, you want to make sure they're regularly scheduled and advertised, again, based on the requirements of the municipal code. And you want to follow open meeting rules and rules of order. You want to have a process for the commissioners voting on it. Are they going to vote on it at that meeting, or are they going to look at it overnight and vote on it another way? And you want to have a process for appeals. Here's an example of Martinsburg application. It's on their building department's building permit page. And you can see the things that it requests you to have. In addition, you have to submit plans if you have them, photographs of the building, color chart of the building, and any manufacturer's windows you may have. I mean, manufacturer's literature you may have, such as window details and window shapes and materials. They also ask for material literature, such as if you're changing siding, they want to know what siding is going to be, and they might ask you to have a manufacturer's catalog of that siding. The And they also include the instructions for completing the application and when it is to be submitted and how far in advance of a meeting it is to be submitted. And they give the requirements of what must accompany the application. And then in Martinsburg, some communities may do this different, but in Martinsburg, they require that the applicant be present at the design review meeting because often there's going to be questions. Not every application is totally complete, or some of the reviewers may not understand some of the process. If no one is present, the application is tabled for the next meeting, and if no one attends that meeting, then you have to submit a new application. So there are items like that that you probably should consider how you want to have your design review process proceed. Some resources that you may have. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has a lot of information on design guidelines. The State Historic Preservation Office, as you know how to contact them, I'm sure. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, they have some information, but a lot of their information relates to the economic benefits of historic preservation in districts. The National Council of State Historic Preservation Offices has information, and a real valuable partner is the National Association of Preservation Commissions. A lot of the materials I used to prepare this presentation came from them, or I cut and pasted from them. And then the National Park Service, working on the past, some of the slides were taken directly off of their web pages. There's a pretty good explanation of how and why and what design guidelines are. And of course, as was mentioned previously by maybe Chris or others, the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia is always a good partner, either in providing advice or sometimes providing funds. So I might have gone through it too quickly, but I am fairly early. I'm sorry to say that, or maybe I'm not sorry to say that because I'm not keeping you from your lunch. So if there are any questions, I'll stop sharing, and then I'll let people ask questions if they have any.
All right, we'll start with Mickey because you have your hand up and you put it in the chat as well. But you can either unmute yourself or I can read it out. It's up to you.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because I had seen Mike G go over West Virginia State Code Chapter 8, Article 26. And I was just curious about that because in Wood County, we've had just a couple of issues where, we have been ordered and organized by the Wood County Historic Landmarks Commission, of course, to protect these historic resources. But out of Wood County, only one municipality, and maybe it's unique for Wood County, I don't know if it's the same way in other counties as well, but in the city of Parkersburg, we have, I think, 5 or 6 now different historic districts that each have their own architectural review board that meet at different times at different places. And so a lot of people get upset with the Wood County Historic Landmarks Commission because they come to us and they say, well, why aren't you doing more about this property or this property? And usually our response has always been, well, it follows under the jurisdiction of such and such, the Juliana Street Historic District Architectural Review Board or the Downtown Parkersburg Facade Committee or such and such. So I guess my question is, when you were mentioning West Virginia State Code Chapter 8, Article 26, in those instances where those local communities have architectural review boards or facade committees, does a county historic landmarks commission have any say in that process or anything at all, or is it strictly up to that architectural review board, and if there's any issues, then it gets appealed to circuit court?
My understanding is that it is separate. The Wood County does not have jurisdiction within the incorporated limits of Parkersburg municipality. So unfortunately, as in many things in historic preservation, things are very confusing because there are different players in the situation, and
Right.
you end up getting the brunt of the criticisms, but that's unfortunately the situation.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. I just wanted to double check. Thank you.
Yeah, we always encourage our, countywide CLGs to communicate as best you can with smaller municipalities, city CLGs, and community resources. I know with Parkersburg, it is kind of big and nebulous, but it's always good to kind of keep everybody in check and not in check, but just to have sort of open communication and get to a similar place with everybody of what's important to protect and how we do that.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Easier said than done, but let us know if we can help
Yeah.
with it too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, James, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, I'm James Hilton. I live in Charlestown. I've been on the Landmarks Commission for about a year, and there is I'm wondering, are county buildings subject to the design standards?
Similar answer, I think, is that just as a county can't control the federal government, the municipality can't control the county government. That's my understanding of the hierarchy of legislature in West Virginia.
Yeah. Well, I maybe I can appeal to them that there's a building called the Iron Rail. It was called the Iron Rail Inn. It had elaborate ironwork on it. It's beautiful, and they took the ironwork when they replaced the roof. They took the ironwork off the porch roof. So I was told, well, there's nothing you can really say, but maybe I could approach them and just plead with them that it's the right thing to do.
Right. Yeah. Try to explain, as we said in the previous session, said the benefits of historic district. You want to protect the integrity of the overall district and ask them to be good players in the district.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll go with Amanda, and then I think Elizabeth had a question.
Hi there, and thanks for the session, Mike. It was really informative. I'm the chair of the City of Charlestown's local Historic Landmarks Commission, and we have a situation here in town where not all of our historic neighborhoods have been included in our current overlay, and we're looking into the possibility of expanding that. So when you were talking about notifying the ownership that lives in that proposed district of the possible expansion of the overlay, can that be done in these technological new times we're living in via publishing the intent to do so on a website, or does it have to be done by certified mail? How is all that determined?
Meredith can probably answer this better than I can. I think it depends on the number of properties in the historic district. If it's under a certain number, then the notification can be published, and it may need to be a legal advertisement in your local newspaper. I'm not sure how social media plays into that.
And I hate to pass the buck to Cody, but Cody, you do this with National Register nominations. So do you know, do you have any sense of that as well?
I mean, for me with nominations, we still put legal ads in the papers. I mean, the law regulating that is probably a bit outdated now. It hasn't been updated to reflect the presence of social media and the decline of newspapers, but legally, I still just put ads in the paper for nomination notifications.
Okay.
And you
So-
might look, you might ask your city attorney, because they may have recommendations on how things are supposed to be publicized.
Okay. Yeah, we've kind of taken those steps, Randy and I, towards doing that, started the process. We don't necessarily have a lot of council support for the initiative. So we've kind of taken it to the residents slowly. But what our attorney said is that we need to do it via certified mailings. So I was just curious if the newspaper listing, and that's one of the big pushback components we have is, oh, the city doesn't have enough money or time to devote to that effort right now, but a lot of the residents, of which I am one, as is Randy, we live in our historic South Charlestown neighborhood that we want to be included in the overlay, proposing to be included. So I was just curious if there was more than one way to do it, to accommodate the residents' wants.
And we can certainly take a look and get back to you too. That's just not something I'm super familiar with, but we can help you out and see what we can find on our end as well.
Appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Sure.
And if it's a problem, that may be a legislative policy, but you guys aren't supposed to talk about that. So APT can look at that for you.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Elizabeth, did you still have a question?
Oh no, it was brought up. Thank you.
I had a question for Mike. As a consultant, how do you balance federal preservation standards with the desires of communities that you work with to create guidelines? So like some towns might care more or less about, historic windows staying on secondary facades. So how do you kind of strike that balance and make sure everybody's heard, but also follow standards?
I guess ultimately it should be up to the locality, as we said in all of the sessions, that you are locally driven and locally controlled, hopefully. The problem arises when, and it's part of this confusion of multiple players in the field, of when a property owner wants to apply for grants or tax credits and the locality has approved something that the National Park Service would not approve. And so you just need to make it clear to the design review committee that that's a potential problem. And maybe one activity could be to review the existing design guidelines or the proposed design guidelines and see where they conflict with federal Secretary of the Interior standards, and then make it clear to the design review committee that that's a potential future problem. And they may or may not decide to go that way. It's confusing. I have property owners say, well, the city approved me. Why is Washington denying my project? And I said, that's different people.
Yeah, we even have that in our manual for the tax credit. It's like, if someone else approves it, doesn't mean that, we will. So it could be tricky.